Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I hope you're all comfortable and you put your cell phones on silent so we can concentrate on our talk today. I'd like to welcome you all to this public lecture that's hosted by the Science and Society program here at NCBS. I'd like to thank the British Council and ICER, Pune, for organizing the Science and Beyond Lecture Series. And today, Dr. John Turney is going to get us started on a series of 4 lectures that we're going to be hosting as part of this lecture series. And I'd like to begin by inviting Dr. Raghupadinath to say a few words of welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. So first of all, for those of you who are not from our campus, a very warm welcome here. And I hope you enjoy your time here as well as the lecture that we're about to listen to. Just a very few words of introduction. I guess one can debate what the history of science starts, but perhaps it's not unfair to say that most of it began with the interest of human beings in natural phenomena, whether there was a human body or whether it was astronomy and observations in the cosmos. And therefore, in science, we have always been motivated by interaction with regular people in society, their interest in phenomena and how to understand them in a professional sort of way, which is what we scientists do. So at NCBS, we have a large number of very diverse programs that look at scientific phenomena at different levels, all the way from molecules through to ecosystems. And as a concept, and one of the things that we like to do is also promote interaction between our professional scientific programs and that of the lay public society, what they think of science and how they interact with scientists and scientific topics. And for this reason, we've had a very great interest in Science and Society program, which organizes a diverse set of events over the year. And we're very delighted to partner with the British Council and ICER Pune to host today's talk. So very warm welcome to our speaker today, and I think without any further ado, we'll listen to him.
Leibniz is known to have said that the present is pregnant with the future. Of course, one has no data about the future, and imagining it seems to be as much about studying the past as it is about making predictions about time that is yet to come. For those of us working in science and knowledge production in this sphere, this idea is particularly important. How does the history of what we've questioned, discovered, invented, determine what we will look for today and in the future that is to come? We do seem as a species to be agents of significant change and have impacted the landscape of the Earth in a large way. So with all of that, Dr. Turney, we hope to hear from you about new ways of thinking about these questions, about our imaginary for the future, which appears as always to be the most uncertain of all times. And I'd now like to request Leighton Ernsberger, who heads the British Council offices in Bangalore, and this Assistant Director of Skills for the British Council, to introduce Dr. John Turney. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today. Dr. John Turney is the first in our lecture series, as you've been told, as part of our International Higher Education Program. We thank you all for coming here today. We are partnering, as we said, with the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research in Pune. We're very pleased to be partnering with NCBS for this particular talk today. Dr. John Turney has been a science writer, editor, reviewer since the 1980s, with spells as a journalist in the Times Higher Education Supplement, academic at UCL, and publisher with Alan Lane. John has written for a wide range of audiences, producing everything from books to museum exhibitions, guides to school resources. Now, he mainly writes books. In 2012, John wrote a book that looked at 50 years of heart disease, research and therapy, written with Julian Clayton for the British Heart Foundation's anniversary in 2012. And in the past, John has lectured widely, created and taught science communication courses in several universities. And I know science communication is a particularly hot theme right now in India, so we hope to learn much from you today on that. And you particularly enjoy writing on life sciences, futures, science, society, and policy issues. Your most recent book, I, Superorganism, I believe has just been shortlisted for the Royal Society of Biology's Book Prize. So congratulations on that. Won many, many other prizes. And we look forward to hearing from you today. So thank you very much, Dr. Turney, and I look forward to more.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is my portable device working? Yes. Good. Thank you for those introductions. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you again to the British Council and Sir Pune for bringing me to India. And it's a particular pleasure to, as I've just learnt, to be speaking under the auspices of a Science and Society program, because that's what I've always affiliated to academically, and I've spent most of my career knocking around STS programs of one sort or another in universities or talking to other people who do that. And what I'm going to say to talk about today is somewhat related to that. The series, as you've heard, is called Science and Beyond. I take it this is part of the beyond bit, as you'll see. I want to talk today about the future, as has been said, which is a rather big topic, and I read a book about that a few years ago now. The right button, that's my first slide. That was the cover. And a few years ago now, that bit's important. It means that my book is now part of an ever-growing archive of futures from the past. Something I obviously knew would happen when I wrote it, but I feel it more keenly now, not only partly because the book's out of print, but now that might only be a strictly personal interest, but I think it points to something important about the way we think about the future today. As there are no facts about the future, as our colleague just said, the past is in a way all we have to go on when contemplating what will come next. And when we look at the past now, we found an ever-increasing proliferation of visions of the future. Let me take you back first to just one of them, in 1939. Think about how future visions sometimes used to work. Imagine you're getting on the subway or the New York bus and going here, the World's Fair of 1939, along with millions of other excited or curious visitors. Let's put this on the floor. Lecterns are never big enough now because they always have computers on them as well, but somebody futurist fails to foresee. This fair was a spectacular success. If it was photographed artfully, it even looked a bit like the poster. And the exhibit that impressed the most people was probably in the General Motors Pavilion. It was called Futurama, which in this old film we are now approaching. The crowds were really quite large. If you got to the front of that queue eventually, you climbed inside a space, and this is a sort of theme park ride, 1939 style. You sat in these chairs, and they spanned round a circular track around an enormous diorama, which was an image of the future of the United States. Very well-dressed visitors they had in those days. The landscape was designed by very influential American designer Norman Bell Geddes, and he indulged himself with visions of towering cities, 6-lane, 8-lane, 10-lane superhighways and expressways, vast fleets of cars, all modelled and miniaturized and going around the diorama, and people could sit and watch this future in action in some detail, as it were. And now at that time, which was 1939, none of this existed. But car ownership and road building were already on a steep upward trajectory in the USA, and this exhibit was essentially designed to consolidate that path. The American novelist E.L. Doctorow has a rather good novel called World's Fair, in which, among other things, he recreates a visit to a 1939 fair, and one family comes out of Futurama. The father says, "General Motors is telling us what they expect from us. We must build them the highways, and they can sell us the cars." And after 1945, the US government complied, pretty much. They built the interstate highway system. It ended up, it's said, as the largest, or certainly then, the largest civil engineering project in history. Between 1956, it took a little while to get going after the war, the US spent $114 billion in 1956 and 1992 when it was finally finished. $114 billion, which converts to maybe $500 billion in current values on the interstate highway network. And, not surprisingly, that did indeed expedite larger sales of General Motors products to American families. So that's one way to deal with the future. It was prediction, if you like, but of a very particular kind. The Futurama appeared at a time when technological optimism was perhaps at its peak. It was part simple extrapolation, part intentionally self-fulfilling prophecy. And it reminds us that big projects like the metro they're building downtown here, which alter the life of a nation or a city, can come to fruition in half a lifetime or less, if they capture the imagination enough to mobilize the resources to become enacted. When people staggered out into the sunlight from this mind-blowing exhibit, as well as of an impression of all this, they came away, most of them, with one of these. I'd love to have one of these in my hand. I've never seen one, but it's just a pin button, so you can tell pretty clearly what it was like from the image. I have seen the future. This slogan, as a takeaway from an exhibit, intrigues me. I wonder what our reactions are now, or would be, to being offered a badge at the end of an experience like that. That's really my question. And answering that question, I think, invites a deeper look at how we think about futures. I'll get back to a direct answer, but let me work up to it by saying a few things about how we do that in general. Think about the future. In fact, let's go back to basics. Thinking about times to come, as well as times past, is one of the things that mark humans out as different from other species. Neuroscientists studying memory now tell us that it's episodic. That's to say, our recollections of past events are stored in discrete packages, rather than as they might be in a linear stream, like a when we're rerunning a movie. That might just be because that's how the brain works. But it's also true that storing past data that way makes it easier to recombine elements of the past in new ways, because of simple combinatorics. And that's an aid to imagining a larger breadth of possible futures, in fact. So it's an ability that, in other words, is fundamental to the way that we experience the world. But if some kind of futures thinking is a common human concern, the conditions in which we do it have changed a lot. One change is fairly obviously, I think, in terms of timescale. Once it was mainly bound up with the rhythms of individual lives. And that changed too, I think, as we lived. I'm a person from a fortunate country in late middle age now. I can look back 20, 30, even 40 or more years. And maybe assuming a little more good fortune, I can still look forward 10 or 20. And anyone with imagination can look forward, but perhaps living through the actual years gives you a different sense both of history and the future, of tempo and rhythm, of what changes, what stays the same. I read a book in the 1970s by Alvin Toffler called Future Shock, and I feel now in a better position to judge whether future shock is actually a thing, and I've rather concluded that maybe it isn't, because the world looks, in many respects, the continuities are as striking with the time when I read that book 40 years ago as the discontinuities. That sense of past and future as you live is contingent on where you live and when, of course, but the general point is that those kinds of time scales are fairly easy for humans to reckon with. 20 years is enough to raise a child who might be looking to have children of their own. People in the past tended not to wait that long. Many now wait a bit longer, but the variation is not really that great. So let's suggest that a couple of decades is a comfortable scale for starting to think about past and future for most of us. Try a little harder and we can extend it to a couple of lifetimes. Thinking personally again, my grandmother, respect to my grandfather, my grandmother, who lived to be 100, was born in the 1870s. My late father was born in the first decade of the last century. My young grandniece, who just started school, ought to be getting an education which fits her for the century that she may well live to see the beginning of, the 22nd. So just the facts of life invite us to think beyond timescales we can contemplate from immediate personal experience, and they always have. But of course we now reckon with many timescales beyond mere lifetimes. And after immersing myself in futures literature to write that book, I still wonder how we relate to larger slices of time in ways that truly have personal meaning. It is surely hard to really get your head round the idea of people living more than a few tens of generations away from us in either direction. True, the idea of reincarnation or rebirth figures in some of the world's major religions, and those ideas are especially embedded, of course, in the culture of this country, and other belief systems tell of an afterlife in a different realm. And both of those obviously allow an individual's life in existence, in principle, to extend into eternity, but specific images of future lives on Earth, which are what concerns me, are more likely to be restricted to thousands of years, I think, than, say, millions. And in the West, you probably know, this restricted future used to be a mirror image of an abbreviated past. The scholarly 17th century Archbishop James Ussher in Ireland pored over the genealogies in the Bible, keyed certain events described there to historical record, filled in a few gaps, did some sums, and came up with a date for the day the world was created, which he said was in 4004 BC. He even gave the day of the week and the time. And that actually seemed eminently reasonable at the time. It was not much more than 100 lifetimes since Adam, so it was a corridor you could look back down. But since Ussher's day, as you know, the past has been kind of colonized by science and has in consequence has expanded enormously. The Victorians were gripped by the discovery of geological time, I think it was John McPhee who coined the term deep time, and I think that's a nice phrase. We now credit its first announcement to the pioneer Scottish geologist James Hutton, whose 1795 theory of the Earth, not a very readable text, nevertheless had one excellent line in it, and he said the evidence of the rocks, as he read them, showed that there was no vestige of a beginning to the Earth and no prospect of an end. By the early decades of the following century, Victorian intellectuals were digesting Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, with its vistas of mountain building and erosion spanning hundreds of thousands, millions, and even hundreds of millions of years. Big change. And as Hutton's phrase implied, if there was that much history, why would there not be that much future? And since Lyell and Hutton, the scientific story has expanded even further, but lost its symmetry. The most common view is that there was a beginning, of sorts, with the Big Bang, which inaugurated the cosmos, or at least this one. But the end, if there is one at all, is a lot further away. The universe is thought to be around 14 billion years old. I think the current consensus figure is around 13.6. It's rather a lot of lifetimes. But mainstream opinion is the whole thing will go on for much, much longer. It may get old and cold and rather boring, but there seems likely to be a universe of sorts out there for maybe another 10 trillion years or so. So there's plenty of future left to conjure with. So the first thing to ponder, I'm suggesting today in any discussion of the future, is which of these many possible timescales we're actually talking about. Maybe it helps to label them. Let me try. I'm going to go up and take you through the orders of magnitude that I've just briefly scanned. So let's say tens of years. We'll call that personal time, as I indicated. That's the normal range, perhaps, of a career, or marriage, raising your children, if you have them. Up 10, 100 years. Well, let's say that's a lifetime, with luck. 1,000 years now, well, my label for that would be perhaps historical time. A civilization could rise and fall in 1,000 years, and most do. Then it gets trickier. 10,000 years, I think I want to call that archaeological time. agriculture, something on that sort of order of magnitude, about 12,000, 15,000 years ago perhaps. Large human settlements, so something in the tens of thousands range. Go up 10 again, you get to 100,000, and I think we'll call that anthropological time. The hominids who didn't have culture somehow seemed to contrive to invent it somewhere in that 50,000 to 80,000 year range, so that falls within the immediate past 100,000. I'll keep going for a few more tens, not to try your patience. A million. I'll do two at once this time. 1 million to 10 million. I'm having a bit of trouble with a name for that one. I call it provisionally. If you can come up with a better one, please help me. I'm going to call it ape time, because primatologists and evolutionists tell us that apes can turn into hominids in something of that sort of time scale. Well, 100 million, I think, probably I could persuade you would be a reasonable evolutionary time. The big reptiles went away 65 million years ago, and the mammals crept out from the undergrowth and became the dominant evolutionary genre. But evolution, of course, goes back farther than that. But the next order of magnitude up of now 1 billion years, 1,000 million, I want to call that tectonic time because of the geology. That's the time scale on which, as well as deep evolution, where simple creatures begin to become more complex, continents will shift significantly on that sort of time scale. Two more, but the first one is only a half an order of magnitude. 5 billion, I think, needs a name of its own because that's roughly the age of the Earth, 4.5, so let's call that planetary time. We might come back to that term. And then 10 billion, and we could go on. I'll just call cosmological time, about which I have rather little to say because it blows my mind. We can talk about that afterwards. But I labour that list just to bring home the range of times over which our knowledge now, the reach of our minds now extends, to some extent at least, and the different kinds of processes that unfold at each timescale. We can imagine them all or think about them, but one asks again, which of these do I really relate to? Now, it used to be that questions of personal salvation aside, not bothering to think much about the scales beyond decades or lifetimes, didn't really matter. That's not true anymore. In these early days of the 21st century, I want to tell you, we have to face up to the difficulty of thinking seriously about the spans which, while not counted in trillions, nevertheless extend beyond those we adjust to in everyday life. That is our problem. And the need is pressing because we're faced with good evidence of a kind not available to people in the past, that human action has very long-term consequences. You will know the two most obvious examples. As we raise the level of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, some of the carbon dioxide itself will persist for centuries. Some of the effects will go on for millennia, and very likely a good deal longer. Further on, if we cause a mass extinction, as already seems to be happening, in fact, the effects last longer still. The evidence from past such episodes is encouraging in the degree that if you make a whole lot of niches vacant at once, that natural selection will eventually evolve something which fills them again, but on average it takes about 10 million years. So that's the kind of effect we could be having in this century and the next one. Now, there are appreciable efforts, obviously, to try and persuade us to take both of these problems seriously, whereby seriously I mean each of us trying to do something about them in a way that will alter these outcomes. But what we do and why and when are all matters of complex debate. But all those debates have to contend with the mindset shaped by the smaller timescales I tried to describe. And you can see that in some of the quirks of the way that we talk about the future with a capital F. One thing which happened in my lifetime is a shift in what you could think of as the big date with a capital D. When I was growing up, it was sometimes 1984, because it wasn't here yet, and this man wrote a book with that date in the title, and people were a bit worried that whether life would look as grim as that when the year finally arrived. 1984 came and went, and after that it was definitely the year 2000, or possibly 2001, because we always argue about when millennia actually turn. The American computer scientist Danny Hillis complains that there's a generation, and I think he and I are both part of it, for whom the future was a bit annoying because it got a year shorter every December, because you were a year closer to the millennium when you were a kid. In the last decade and a half, we've slowly got used to the idea that we're in a new century, and a bit oddly, you'll often see this described as living in the future. And the most common horizon you now find in professional futures work, for indeed there is some, now seems to be 2050. So we've leapt forward to another thing we're beguiled by the magic of round numbers. Some people try and look further to 2100, which is probably as far as you can sensibly even speculate about most key variables, but those are both timescales many people can relate to, as I said, by remembering what decades feel like. I'm going to leave this question of timescales there and go back soon to that sensation of I have seen the future, to expand on a different problem, and one that also arises, I think, from relatively recent changes. But first, before I do that, one further word about the larger history of thinking about the future. As I said, that has gone on in one way or another throughout human history. So it's kind of how we're built. And you have to be pretty bold to try and sum it up in a few words, so I'm going to let someone else do it. The historian Robert Heilbronner offered a nice, simple scheme in a short book he published in 1995 called Visions of the Future. My first reaction was, this has to be too simple. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've come to feel that actually it works pretty well. So see if you agree. It goes like this. Heilbronner argued that humanity's perceptions of the future and the shape of things to come have changed only twice, really, on the largest view, for almost all of human history. No matter which culture he examined, he found that the future on Earth, that is ignoring any afterlives, was seen essentially as changeless. It was a matter of seasonal cycles, repeated with variations, but no real lasting alteration. Different kings might rise and fall, the crops would be good or bad this year, but on the whole, the cycles were cycles. They turned wherever the local ups and downs were. The conditions of life were expected basically to stay the same. Then, at almost the last moment in history, comes a great change in viewpoint. The second phase, and we could argue about exactly when, but let's take his 200 years. So then it would last roughly from the beginning of the 18th century until the second half of the 20th. Something happened that people began to experience visible change in the present, in their own lifetime. And writers about the future, perhaps in consequence of that, perhaps the two were feeding off each other, invented a new genre and saw a combination of scientific and technical and social and political progress. This is the era of progress. The forces of nature would come under our control, and the resulting prosperity would endow a society of equality and general fulfillment. Timescales come back in here again, as I've suggested, because I say this is the time when, in a single lifetime, you experience change. You'll have come across expressions of this, I'm sure, and let me give you a couple, just for the flavour and to remind you. You might go back to H.G. Wells, remarking on the way the pace was picking up in a pioneering futurological essay, not one of his fictions, that he published in 1902. Again, we're fin de siècle rhetoric. And I quote, "There are many things," wrote Wells, "to suggest that we are now in a period of rapid and unprecedented development. The conditions under which men live are changing with an ever-increasing rapidity. In the past century, there was more change in the conditions of human life than there had been in the previous 1,000 years. This century will see changes that dwarf those of the 19th century, as those of the 19th dwarf those of the 18th. Of course, that idea didn't go away immediately. Here's one later example of undiluted future optimism from the well-known post-World War II writer Herman Kahn in the USA. 1976 now, leaping ahead to the third quarter of the 20th, he wrote in a book called The Next 200 Years, 200 years ago, almost everywhere, human beings were comparatively few, poor, and at the mercy of the forces of nature. And 200 years from now, we expect, almost everywhere, they will be numerous, rich, and in control of the forces of nature. But, as you will also know, by 1976, there were more voices. None of these changes is absolute. There's always dissent, whichever is the dominant voice. But there were more voices saying just the opposite. And Harbronner suggests that's what marks his third phase. So after the whole of history and then 200 years, phase 3 comes on actually quite fast. We have the age in which we now dwell, the age of ambivalence, post-1945. And again, we could discuss precisely when that started, but I personally have no doubt that it is true. The key difference, perhaps, is that the best and the worst outcomes, near utopia or apocalypse at the extremes, were now seen, perhaps are now seen, as real near-term possibilities, at least by some people. In fact, near futures discussions are often dominated by visions of the extremes. I'm sure you've seen them. People love to make CGI images of inundated cities, don't they? This is when global warming gets really, really bad. But by the time that happens, on the other hand, perhaps we will have entered the singularity where, if you subscribe to the right West Coast think tanks in the USA, we will have united with our technology in a wonderful way and uploaded our minds into machines and become technologically immortal, or unless the nanobots are keeping our bodies going indefinitely so we don't need to upload. But the two extremes, for some people, are actually real prospects and real projects. And one result of these radically contradictory visions of the future, I think, is a more critical attitude to portrayals of the future. And that's where I'm going next. Because that critical attitude is also reinforced by another feature of the second half of the 20th century that I'm going to focus on for most of the rest of my time. As I worked on that book, and since then, I was very struck by the way we're collectively conscious of the accumulation of past futures, as it were. That consciousness seems to me to grow ever stronger. And that is indeed partly a result of people actively trying to stoke it up, a sort of active excavation and curation of futures past. And there's huge appeal in a lot of the imagery that we recover from depictions of past futures in particular, as well as the language of past imagining and forecasting. They evoke, I think the best thing to do is to call it a kind of nostalgia for the future. And I say it's evoked most strongly by images and not words. You can feel it, I imagine, when you see images like this. Which one's coming up next? Oh, yes. This is around 1960. This is an American couple, as you might guess, contemplating, well, perhaps the house of the future. I'm taking this as generic of a certain kind of future gazing, but their gaze is directed not at the house, but at the horizon, at the wonders to come. It's an atmosphere straight out of a World's Fair exhibit, or possibly out of one of the billboards I see on the expressway every time I go from one Indian city to another, with the new apartment blocks that are where the rich are going to dwell in worlds of wonder. And sometimes projects with in that spirit, in fact, were still enacted. I found this serendipitously yesterday. This is a city of the future where the project was not unlike the 1939 World's Fair diorama. It was India's City of the Future, which the design to which, involving Le Corbusier, began in 1947. This is a future pointing image because it's from a British children's book called A Flight to India, published in 1961, of what Chandikar was going to look like. And as we know, this city in fact did get built, and happily does look not unlike that. So sometimes the old future vision, self-fulfilling prophecy, here's where we're going, let's paint a nice picture thing, did actually work. But less and less often. In 1964, for example, the World's Fair returned to New York. They go around in a cycle. And there was a new Futurama, again courtesy of General Motors, and it offered more far-reaching visions than were proposed in 1939. Now they were going to, sorry, that's the General Motors Pavilion in 1964. Now, of course, there were going to be moon bases, which were much talked about at that time, and the other great fancy of the early 1960s, which somehow does seem to have gone away, undersea cities were in the dioramas inside this new Futurama vision of wonders of the future, and many other things. But this kind of visions, I'm suggesting, became harder and harder to sustain. And in fact, the main public exhibit where this kind of thing now survives is in the future-oriented sections of various Walt Disney theme parks. And even those are as much a homage to past visions of the future as possible times to come. The American humorist P.J. O'Rourke noted when Disney's theme park called Tomorrowland was established in 1998. Sorry, it was refurbished in 1998. That's an interesting notion, isn't it? Refurbishing tomorrow. The corporation described their latest creation as, quote, a classic future environment. It had a style which O'Rourke dubbed the Jules vernacular. And indeed, Tomorrowland's equivalent on Disney's site in Paris is called Discoveryland. Is actually a tribute. It's not about the future. It's a tribute to Jules Verne and among other futurists. And so that's a depiction of the one of the interests of Tomorrowland with this sort of wonderful, sort of spacey theme park rides. Is that it's not an entirely serious place to visit. And Futurama, of course, nowadays is not a World's Fair exhibit. It's a cartoon series set 300 years in the future, which has great fun with all our past ideas of what the world to come was going to be like. All of those things, you can see from the way I can recover these pictures, help persuade us that it's much easier nowadays also to recover images of past futures. There are books, there are exhibitions, there are websites which catalogue fantastic futures that are fairly easy to come by. And I think I will go straight to some of those. So there's a kind of consistent background of this kind of thing now. Occasionally it hits a media peak. Excuse me. We've had a spectacular example in the last few weeks because of Back to the Future, of course. The 30th anniversary of the movie, which very unlikely event that you don't know, I will remind you, is a time travel story in which at one point the characters visit 2015, which was then in their future, and cue almost unlimited number of comparisons, some serious, most not, about how the visions of the future in Back to the Future compare with the future that we're now apparently in. But that's just one example. There are many others. This is just a collection of some of the books I've acquired over the last few years. Out of Time, designs for the 20th century future. You can tell the skeptical attitude from the titles. Follies of Science, 20th century visions of our fantastic future, not self-fulfilling prophecies at all. The book drawn from articles in Popular Mechanics, which the science fiction writer Greg Benford helped put together, they decided to call The Wonderful Future That Never Was. And one of my favourites, this is a rather brilliant, it's actually not a direct excavation of past futures, it's a graphic novel called Whatever Happens to the World of Tomorrow, which begins with a small boy visiting the World's Fair in 1939 in New York and falling in love with the future he saw there, and then takes you through his life in tandem with a narrative of possible futuristic episodes and how it actually turned out very, very nicely done and depicted. Almost succinctly, where is my jetpack? A question which can now be answered with suitable imagery at book length, and occasionally is. Now, action and reaction is as much a feature of cultural history as it is in physics, so these commentaries in turn produce efforts to revive the techno-optimism of the past. a spirit, I'm not going to do Back to the Future, but a spirit captured in the recent movie Tomorrowland. Nothing to do with the Disney theme park. It's a kids' film. It's a science fictional adventure story which is all about rescuing a lost future. And for those of us who like future images, the joy of watching this film was the way they lovingly recreated the sort of future that was supposedly talked about and put it on the screen. This is viewed from a distance. The rendering is actually rather beautiful. This is the first, the girl heroine's first glimpse of the future city as it might be, the one that went away. But where do these comments, retrospectives, nostalgia trips, and ironic references, as they frequently are, when I have kind of ironic, jaded, and wearied futures, as well as exciting, eager to can't wait for them ones, where do they leave actual serious work by futurists trying to tell us serious things about what might happen and what we might try and do about it? Because that's something we still need, as I argued earlier. We probably need it in this century more than we ever did before, and for more serious reasons. Well, some new efforts, as ever, are basically still just regular sales pitches. And we can easily read them as such, and often we may conclude they're a little bit ridiculous. If I told you this was another CGI fashion still from Tomorrowland, the movie, you probably wouldn't know any different. But in fact, it's from a video promoting a flying car. You can sort of tell that's what it is, can't you? In one which is supposed to be available to buy next year, or possibly the one after that. And Matt Novak, who curates, American who curates a rather wonderful website called Paleo Future, highlights this one and joins many in pointing out that there have been advertisements rather like this for flying cars as long as most of us can remember, in fact, many decades. And they're always a couple of years away from going into production. As he says, all that Terrafugia, who's the American company concerned here, really do is make rather nice animations. That's not to say that a vehicle that could drive on the road and fly a little couldn't be built. Some have been. We could spend an entire lecture hour watching videos of existing models or animations like this one, of which the still's taken. But the plausibility of this one, which is vertical takeoff and landing, and because it's trendy, has a hybrid engine, so it's ecologically friendly, and does 200 miles an hour, I think is unusually low if you actually check the physics. We'd all love to fly, and personal flight, and this is plainly futurism as wishful thinking. I don't think that matters too much. People are entitled to dream, and they're even entitled to retire to their workshops and try and make something that looks a bit like the dream. But there is a more serious consequence of the preservation and accumulation of all these images of possible futures that aren't very likely. They reinforce a tendency, I think, for more rigorous futures work to become, well, kind of self-undermining. And partly because of the premises where I'm speaking today, I'll try and experiment on maybe that by analogy. I'm wearing my science writer's hat. One of the things that comes to mind when I use that phrase is the Human Genome Project, which was launched with great fanfare, was a realizable project. We knew how much human DNA sequence there was. We knew that we could actually work through every single goddamn base pair. And at the end of that, we were going to cure cancer, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, and everything else in about 5 years, because we'd know all there was to know about the human organism. Those premises, of course, proved to be a little too simple, and although we did indeed enact the Human Genome Project successfully and produce technology which can now sequence as much DNA as you like anywhere, it seems to me still that in some respects the more you do of it, the DNA sequencing, the less useful it may seem. It's self-undermining in that sense. And whether you agree with that or not, that's what I'm suggesting is happens with the accumulation of futures imagery. The more you have of it, the harder it is to engage seriously in further futures work. The logic of that's fairly simple. I think that all forecasts turn out to be a bit wrong, and most of them are completely wrong. And as interest in futures expands, the number of forecasts in the record that we can look back on, even if they're just speculations that are seen as forecasts, keeps on increasing. They never go away, because nothing ever goes away anymore because of the internet. And if you review the past forecasts, most of them conclude that forecasters got it completely wrong. I think that does tend to undermine faith in futures work and in forecasting as an activity. And there's nothing much to be done about that, really. It's the nature of the beast. The longer futures has been around as a line of work, I mean, it's real work, not making pictures like this, maybe the less respect it seems to get. And it's now been around long enough for the effects of this to be visible. Now, as I move toward the finish, in professional futures work, it's true everyone recognizes that serious efforts aren't actually about prediction. We don't know what's going to happen. There are no facts about the future. And everyone's approach in the think tanks and the reports and the government advisory bodies and the corporate operations is to present some variation of disciplined thinking about future possibilities, helping us prepare for future contingencies, more robust strategies, flexibility, try and identify the crucial variables in a particular domain, and perhaps generating scenarios or stories to think with, to have a more informed discussion about how we might act in ways that are more likely to produce preferable rather than futures we don't want to live in. And if you talk to people about futures, they'll probably accept both that prediction is a daft idea and that all those other things are interesting and useful to do. But again, I ask, do they really believe it? I don't think they do. We still want to see the future. And that leaves serious professionals trying to contribute to discussions of the future in I think, a difficult position. Everywhere, in all countries, including this one, where futures work, perhaps not as profuse as in some countries that have been doing it longer, nevertheless does exist. There's one of the covers of a few that I found while I was preparing this talk. Visions of possible Indian futures are out there if you care to dig. But I think the people doing this kind of work are in a bit of a bind just now. Serious futurists do have at their disposal plenty of techniques for illustrating possible futures without making predictions. But however much care they take to avoid doing that, that's still how their work in the first place will be read. If you produce scenarios with alternatives, excuse me, and those aren't going to go away because we're always going to use storytelling to communicate what it is we'd like people to think about. The media are, as you know, are averse to caveats. They don't handle probabilities terribly well, or ranges, and they nearly always highlight the worst case scenario because that's going to be news. It's not in the body of the story, then certainly in the headline. Think of the discussion of climate change or newly emerging diseases, flu pandemics, terrorism, food security or the world economy. It's the real large downside scenarios that preoccupy us. Or if reporters, and I was once, perhaps I should say we reporters, don't do that, they leap to the furthest optimistic statement where every minor advance in treating the diseases of aging becomes a step on the path to immortality, the other, which is nearly as strong a human dream as flying cars. So in the media then, I think futurists will still be browbeaten into giving quotable predictions, even if they're trying not to, and heard as making them even when they really have tried. Otherwise there isn't generally a story, and that applies, as I've said, to the upbeat predictions as well as to the apocalypse soon stories. And in general they'll continue to turn out to be wrong, or at least I hope they will, especially the apocalyptic ones. So the futures as an endeavour will go on, but always at the risk of being made to look slightly ridiculous or being compared to easily available past visions which are now ridiculous, or maybe always were. So overall, just to conclude, I think our consideration of the future is beset by a slightly bewildering array of varieties of doubt. In the West, certainly there's a substantial portion of the population who doubt the larger narrative of technological progress, because we've lived through so much technology and sometimes seen the downside. But that vision that seemed to inspire many people through the 19th and 20th centuries. Equally, there are plenty who are ready to doubt the worst projections of, for example, global change, where the changes are in fact one consequence of that technological progress. But both those kinds of doubt may turn the wheel a bit further, because they may compel people to make more extreme claims about future progress or future disaster to get attention. But they also in turn reinforce the skepticism. And again, that finally increases doubt about the value of any kind of futurological thinking, which I want to affirm is still worth doing. It can induce, it seems to me, or I fear, a kind of fatalism. We'll get what we'll get, and there's not much we can do about it, and we probably deserve it anyway. There are always exceptions, of course, and I cleave to those. I'm dealing here in very broad terms with the endless complexities of cultural history, not with something that can be weighed or measured. And there may well be more exceptions in countries that I know far less about, including this one, so do please tell me. But I think I'm going to be grand and say the human situation in the 21st century demands more intelligent and more realistic thinking about the future and the options it may offer, and not less. And that suggests we need to look at the history of past futures not as entertainments, not as wrong-headed efforts or amusing misconceptions, or, in a few rare cases, even as magically prescient visions. They're in the mass, there are attempts to do a necessary job, which we'll continue to be compelled to do, if only because we want to enclose our lives in a larger narrative. They are inevitably imperfect, but as we consider where they went astray, we should try and use them to enforce our hopes that we can learn to do better. Thank you. And I'm very happy if anyone has any questions or comments or extra examples that contradict my narrative.
Thank you, Dr. Turney. Questions?
So, put my glasses on so I can see you.
Yeah. So, even throughout your presentation and even things we have been reading from childhood, in the Western vision of the future, why is there so much of shiny glass and metal?
That's a good question. I think. Sorry? Winter.
No, I mean, in any
Yes.
parallel representation of the
Mm,
future,
mm.
there's nowhere green to be seen. And,
I see. Oh, you mean so urban futures are always urban?
Yeah. So
Right.
what
Yes.
we are.
I know exactly what you mean, and some of these pictures clearly support that. Glass and metal, I think, because material technologies were some of the early impressive ones. It's interesting to me how much future technological speculation is still actually about materials, but now it's nanotech. But I think there would be counterexamples to your suggestion. I mean, there are lots of future visions are of somehow eco-cities which magically combine the virtues and conveniences of urban life with access to greenery and environmental stimulus. And if E.O. Wilson's biophilia hypothesis is correct, and we all need the aesthetic and spiritual fuel of seeing those kind of landscapes, we can get them, if not inside the city, then certainly just outside, because it's very compact. There's sort of enormous tower blocks thinly populating green parks, which appear so often on posters. And in fact, the expressway billboards, which I mentioned, which have obviously impressed me since I arrived here. You only ever see 2 or 3 blocks. They're surrounded by green typically, where of course if you look at the city there are 10,000 and a few trees in between if you're lucky. But I don't know the why. But perhaps I'm not inclined to wonder too much about that, because I personally am afraid I'm a totally urban creature and rather like artificial environments, and find even the beautiful English countryside really quite dull. But that's my problem.
Thanks. I found your talk very interesting. I've been teaching a course on science fiction, cinema, and the modern world in Bangalore. And one of the assignments that I said to my students was to speculate 20 years into the future, which was usually challenging, even though you said it would fall within the remit of personal time. I'm interested in the methodology that you're suggesting in terms of thinking about past futures. And I'm wondering if one of the reasons as to why futurist predictions have not quite materialized in the way they have hoped they would is because this kind of methodology doesn't account for this idea of the event. I'm thinking of Badu's work, right? So of unpredictability and things changing radically in terms of the social. So how does one bring the technological in conversation with just the pure affect, subjectivity, and kind of passion of the human being? Because that is a huge challenge.
Indeed it is. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, obviously, or I'd be a very well-paid and much more successful than the other type futurist. Lots of things in that question. I mean, mentioning films makes me conscious of an omission. I mean, I've used images here because I'm giving a talk, but I tend to be drawn to work with text. But of course, other thing that happened in the 20th century was that this literature of stories, particularly in science fiction, which is a rich and very varied genre, came to eventually to dominate in some ways cinema. So most people's image of science fictional futures comes from blockbuster movies, which are a very thin slice through science fiction as a genre. But I could imagine fitting images from something like Blade Runner, which certainly dominates part of my imagination of future cities, into a talk like this, whether that's a prediction or a prognostication. The more serious question about how one helps people think about what could actually change is very hard. I mean, what technology, the gadgets, the shiny things are sort of concrete. I think it is true that certainly a lot of past serious futures work has been sociologically weak. And you can see it in the images. The future city is always full of nuclear families where the woman is making the meal by pushing a button in the kitchen, and the husband is on the video phone in the office telling her what buttons to push to program the supper of his preference. But there's no social or gender or division of labour change whatsoever. I mean, we make fun of those now. Every now and again a futurist comes along who's a bit more imaginative than that, and we do get different stories to think with. And I would actually look to fiction for some of those. I mean, science fiction is full of people who've tried very hard to think of different kinds of human relation. But history, events, social change is very hard to read. I mean, I think that is near term. Futurists just tend to look for what they call weak signals and just extrapolate a small change they may see in one place and imagine it moving further. I think that can work well for technology. William Gibson said the way to think about a technology is to imagine what the world would be like if everyone had one, which I think is a useful tip. But and the history and events, I mean, scenario writers, they always have wild cards and a knowledge that the predictability, whatever you predict, may be radically skewed by some large event you didn't foresee. But we have to do what we can. It's better to try and think about the future than not, because then you know absolutely nothing. If you have a a forecast that turns out to be wrong, at least you have some comparisons to make you could think what was nearly right, what was completely wrong, and how you steer a path through the next stage. It's always a hopefully self-correcting maneuver that never quite hits the target because the target has moved.
So I have a counterpoint question to that, and that is that actually I have read a lot of discussions recently that actually the future may be more predictable because of the cyclical nature of humanity. I mean, the one most prominent I can think of is the generational theory, right, which you're probably familiar with, that, you know, every 20 years or so, this is basically based on Anglo-American history, but has served to at least predict the past 30 years relatively accurately.
Predict the past, retrodict, as they would say.
No. It was originated in the 70s and 80s, and it fairly accurately predicted a economic crisis in the early 2000s, and as well as a somewhat of a security crisis, at least in America, coinciding with the turn of the century, which also happened. So, and it's basically based upon how generations turn over. I don't necessarily support it. I'm just bringing
me
it up
neither. Well, there are. I mean, when any given thing happens, then there are people who will claim to have predicted it. I mean, and of course, there's always a range. So,
like Nostradamus.
There are. That name did come to mind as you were voicing your question. Actually, there are perhaps some things. There are people are pattern recognizing creatures. Sometimes they discern patterns which aren't actually there, and there have been much larger cyclical theories of history in the past. Of course, the totalizing theories of history are somewhat out of fashion now. I was asked a question the other day about Francis Fukuyama and the end of history. I think the nearest candidate that I would give some credence to in that realm is what's called the long wave theory of economic development, which says that each successive wave of capitalist accumulation is made possible by a set of new sort of generic technologies that fit together. So beginning with steam and then moving through steel and electricity, and then I forget which one's ever, which was elaborated by Kondratiev in the 1930s, I think, and has been examined in more detail by other economists who were very good at marshalling historical statistics since. And then, of course, everyone is trying to catch the next wave, so you get, and the consequence is that every government ends up investing in pretty much the same set of generic technologies with the same vision, although the technology changes from time to time, or the name changes. So what in the 1980s, when I was a science reporter, what was called new materials is now nanotech, which is going to save us all. But whether even those large economic cycles are correct, I mean, if we can predict the next crash, then we can all sell our shareholdings and invest in the right hedge fund and become extremely rich. So let's do that. Let's see when I talk afterwards and make a plan. Sorry, where am I looking? Oh, hi.
Hi.
Big theatre.
Thinking about this science fiction and fantasy author named Ursula K. Le Guin.
Indeed, I was thinking of her when I said there are some people who've tried very hard to think about new ways of human relations might work.
Okay. Yeah.
My hero.
So I was thinking about a recent quote by her about the value of science fiction and fantasy, which is that it lets you, especially in times when you have, possible looming crises of various kinds, it lets you imagine your way out of them. It lets you imagine alternate ways of being, which is precisely what she spent her whole life doing.
Indeed.
And I was thinking about that as an alternate value to these Futuramas. It's not just, even if they don't necessarily have that much predictive power, it lets you think about what present action do we need to get out of this mess. That kind of thing.
Maybe so. Well, yes, I think that's a very nice way of putting it. I mean, if you think that we're gifted with episodic memory because that gives us one set of resources for thinking our way through future crises by making new combinatoric scenarios from what we've got before, then trying to do futures thinking would be an enrichment of those resources, because there would be things we'd thought our way through which hadn't yet happened. And I agree. I think that is one of the features of her writing. I mean, she's an enormous hero of mine. Indeed, I used a quote from, I think, a non-fiction essay of hers as an epigraph, which I think was only when it's considered in something like only when it's considered in relation to the future is an act, a truly human act. And she, being a person of huge intellectual power, I think has actually managed to work that perception into her fiction and story making in ways that, much as I love science fiction, sadly not very many other science fiction authors have, although I could think of other examples. So yeah, Ursula Le Guin, everyone, forget the professional futurists, go and read Ursula, who, to my enormous pleasure, is 80-something and is still alive and writing rather good stories.
So you talked about the idea of the best way to think about technology is to imagine everybody had one. So think about futurism, if everybody bought into it.
Yeah.
It would be a sort of strange place. And yet it's sort of, this idea comes naturally to us, as you say. We all have a tendency to want to see the future. So I want to ask you, what are the stabilizing influences that sort of prevent us from falling down that trap? Is it religion? Is it just the drudgery of daily life that stops us from looking ahead? And so this stabilizing influence of not believing the futurists, where does that come from?
Well, I guess in the talk I was trying to say that part of the not believing them comes from looking at things they said last week, and an ever-growing record of those sort of statements. The other, I don't know. I think everyone must answer that for themselves. I mean, when I think about the timescales and the dates and generations and decades and so on, there's another slightly evil thought, which, although I care about the future, I think still comes into my mind, which says, the current date for, most popular date for scenarios is, let's say it's 2050, and actually I'll be dead, so I'm not going to worry too much. And although I try to put that thought aside, it still comes back unbidden at certain moments. So perhaps that's part of it. An awareness of mortality invites us to try and think of a future which, in some way, or contribution we make to a future which transcends that. But it also does kind of provide a natural cut-off. Do you think? Still, unless you're Ray Kurzweil, in which case you're going to be immortal, so you have to worry about the longer term.
Yeah. As a designer, I mean, we often talk about future trends.
Future trends?
Trends, yes.
Yes.
Which is not very much in the future, but it's like.
Yeah.
And today, there's also a lot of big data floating around now with technology. And
yes. That's what it does, doesn't it? It just floats around. You don't know what to do with it.
But I was wondering whether now with that much more information, like you were saying that in the past we didn't have that much information and we projected. Are we going to make fewer mistakes in projecting the future? Or,
I'm not hugely optimistic about it. I think big data is an astonishing resource, and there will be uses which we can't yet imagine. But it depends. That sort of prediction of, I mean, if you're saying you're predicting the behaviour of some system, and it's a socio-technical human system and now global system of unspeakable complexity, however much data you've got and however much computational power, it's about the algorithm, and I'm not sure that we have it. I mean, the thing that I know a little bit about there would be global circulation models which are used to predict future climate in the face of greenhouse gas emissions and energy balance. And you go to a meeting of climate scientists and have them talk about their future research, and there will be some who will still say we need larger and more expensive, of course, and shinier and much, much faster supercomputers with more processing power to refine our models so that we can provide better predictions and help policymakers behave rationally in an uncertain world, but which to that degree becomes less uncertain. And then that's probably because most of them are physicists by training. And then there are others who will say, well, yes, that's true, but people have been saying it since 1970, and we've had 6 generations of advances in computing power since then to speeds that were then inconceivable, and the the figure for climate sensitivity, which is the projected average global temperature rise if the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere doubles, is still pretty much the same value as it was in 1970, and so are the error bounds. So far, it ain't working. Well, it's a good figure to have, and we should heed it, because all the models say the temperature will go up, but they still have the same range. I see any more hands? Is that right? Oh, who has the talking stick? Right.
To what extent do you think it's just status symbols that drive future developments? As in, when I look at those pictures, they are full of status symbols.
That's true. I don't know. I mean, humans are creatures of culture. Technology is part of culture. We fit those sort of things into our value system in that way. So a car is a nice thing which provides personal mobility on one model of a transport system. That clearly appeals to a lot of people. There are other ways of building transport systems. Maybe they were overthrown in part because the car can also be used to express lots of other things, if it's big enough and shiny enough and has enough fins, and also has a convenient back seat for amorous pursuits on a Saturday night. But particular technologies go that way, and then some people have argued that people invest less in their personal selves in cars now because they love their smartphones so much, which perhaps materially is an advance because they cost the planet less each one than a large automobile does. But I speak as one who no longer owns a car, but I hardly ever use a smartphone either, so I don't really know how people relate to these things anymore. But yes, status, technology, material pursuit. But it's also, I mean, technology is about, is the way that human beings make their environment livable on a planet which, over a large part of its expanse, is not actually very hospitable.
So I was wondering, in this whole relationship that you've described in terms of popular culture and science, the one part that I thought was missing was religion and this sort of dialectical relationship between science and faith somehow.
Yeah.
And even in your post-1945 account of years where things were predicted to change, 2011 was seen as this moment that reverted to the Mayan civilization and their prediction of the end of the world.
Oh yes, yes.
And of course, I'm thinking more locally as well in terms of Indian science historians who've worked with histories of astrology and their bases for making scientific claims based on the relationship between astronomy and religion. So I'm wondering how you account for this relationship between science and faith in making claims for the future, and whether they're as valid or less valid or not at all valid in this context.
Will you allow me to sidestep that a bit? I mean, the large question you asked there, how do I account for the relation between science and religion and relation to visions of the future? I think that would require a whole other lecture, and probably a lecture from someone else, because I'm very weak on this topic. I never had a conversion experience like Richard Dawkins. I just never saw anything in the whole God thing at all, and I'm a completely boring English secular rationalist. And I like being that way, and I'm afraid I kind of find religion really hard to take seriously at all. So, but I see that it's one of the answers to the human situation, the condition of mortality, and it does provide other future narratives, which are, for many people, are valuable alternatives. None of them I really understand at all or comprehend. And there's clearly crosstalk between anyone who tries to posit a vision of the future And the Enlightenment vision of progress is essentially a turn away from religious salvation toward material improvement on the earth, and will fashion, if not heaven on earth, and something much preferable. And there are still people who essentially believe that. There's a lot of religious, there's a lot of echoes of religious discourse in the language of the people who preach the singularity. The phrase "the rapture of the nerds," which has been stuck on them, I think is apt, and that they're clearly looking for a secular salvation by abolishing mortality as a material project, as a scientific research project on Earth. They might even manage it one day. Someone did a survey of all the people talking about the singularity and said the average date on which they predict it will arise is always when the author is about 70, which in 10 years' time I may find more insightful than I do now. And there are plenty of people, as you allude to, who are predicting apocalypse soon. I mean, there's a splendid website, I think it still exists, I'm sure there are other similar ones, if not from the States, which charts the rapture index, which begins with the book of Revelations and goes through current events. I don't think they're using big data yet, but they look at the news fairly closely and find signs and portents, and almost any bad thing happening in the world can be read back onto the book of Revelations in some way. And I haven't checked it recently, but I would confidently predict that if you go and dig it up on Google, you'll find that currently the rapture index is high. But I'm not too bothered about that personally.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I have two questions, if it's not too cheeky. One is, why is everyone so obsessed with the Anthropocene? And it just seems to be everywhere at the moment. And
that's the lecture I'm giving tomorrow.
Oh, right. Okay.
But I'm trying to answer that. Yeah.
Secondly, slightly more seriously, the whole kind of idea of diegetic prototypes and kind of design thinking and design fictions. Do you think that the difference, if you like, between science fiction and speculative fiction, because it's something I've been trying to grapple with a bit, and I've been teaching, I've been doing a course with my students on what does it mean to be human and AI, and we watched Her, which is obviously a very near future vision, the one with Joaquin Phoenix and the AI that he falls in love with, and it's really interesting because the whole near future world is conceived by UX designers. So, is that actually the way that we should be looking at the future, kind of led by design to kind of demonstrate functionality and then try and fill in the gaps with the technology?
Yeah. Difficult. This is quite detailed, and I think there's a particular niche of discussion here which actually fascinates me, and I'd love to talk to you about it. But to answer briefly, I mean. Should we perhaps explain what a diegetic prototype is? Would you like to, or shall I try? It suggests there are things, particularly because you can depict things with a sort of hyperrealism in cinema. There are certain things which are put in films, which are sort of appear as existence proofs of a technology, and then inspire people to try and actually fashion something like that. The example is probably the dynamic interface in Minority Report, where Tom Cruise interacts with a database by waving his hands around in front of a lighted screen, and there are any number, which was scripted according to a vocabulary which was written by somebody who wanted to make a computer interface like that, who worked with the cinematography. So there's a sort of benign conspiracy, or a collaboration there between film, which can do certain things that text can't, perhaps. I like design fiction a lot, and I think there is something, I mean, not for long-term futures, but there is something in helping us debate things in ways that we might otherwise not reach by producing, positing an actual object and fashioning, if not the prototype, then what the prototype would look like if you could build it, and then using that as something to think with. I mean, it doesn't have to be an object, it can be done through many other media, as you know, and perhaps that's one direction in which smaller scale, near-term futures of discussion might usefully explore more if we want to have a discussion about the future of the virtues and possible drawbacks of genetic manipulated plants, then let's think of all kinds of weird and wonderful things we could do with that, and then try and build a little exhibit which allows people to imagine themselves into a world where this technology has been implemented in that way, and then discuss, do we want to go there? Do we want to go somewhere slightly different? Do we want to eat in the meat-free restaurant where it's all grown in in vitro culture and you can eat, Stegosaurus meat that was grown in a petri dish, or and all these things? And I find that some of the design thinking that's been seems to have been popping up in all kinds of different places, but I'm now, because of with globalized communication, these people are talking to each other. I find that extremely interesting. Yeah.
I think this might be a quick question. I was wondering if there's a kind of time scale that people use when they make these predictions. Does anyone not care, like, about the future 1,000 years from now, or is it usually 300 and under?
Well, if you're in a government think tank, I think you're trying to get politicians to move further ahead than, can I win the next election by promising everybody jobs and lower taxes in 3 years' time? And you tend to, you tend to assemble a team of experts and say, well, let's talk really seriously about 2040. Or I've just done some work on with a team looking at future cities, and they were saying 40 years. But some problems which we now consider now naturally invite us to look over the longer term, and people do project certain aspects of climate change over that sort of period. If global surface temperature increases, then sea level will rise in the first instance because water expands when it warms, and although it'll only expand a tiny bit, there's an awful lot of water, but it'll rise more because the ice caps disappear. But ice caps melting takes a really, really long time, which is, I find, a reassuring fact of physics. Biodiversity likewise, and of course there are people having discussions about where we bury nuclear waste, if that's part of our portfolio of energy technologies to help us get out from under a highly carbonized economy. And the half-life of plutonium is 20,000 years, I believe. And there are there are actually discussions about that. So some people say that's a horrific, hubristic thing to do. How could we possibly stash something away with danger signs that people will be able to decode in 20,000 years' time? Stuart Brown would say, 20,000 years? Imagine the technologies we'll have in 20,000 years. You think a little bit of low-grade radioactivity is going to be a problem? Don't be silly. So there is the range, and there are people speculating about, on the grandest scale, because it's fun, on a quasi-cosmological scale. What type of civilization occupies a continent, a planet, a solar system, a galaxy, or a whole cluster of galaxies over cosmic timescales, simply because, or dizzying though it is, we can encompass that with our minds. But that, I think, is more of a form of intellectual play than something that would happen in a serious futurist text. But different people draw those boundaries differently.
Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you for your
Dr.
questions.
Turney,
That was fun. Thanks.
Leighton, did you have a question? I'm sorry. I'm sorry.